What's up, everybody? My name is Demetri Kofinas, and you're listening to Hidden Forces, a podcast that inspires investors, entrepreneurs, and everyday citizens to challenge consensus narratives and learn how to think critically about the systems of power shaping our world. My guest in this episode of Hidden Forces is Jonathan Kirshner, a professor of political science and international studies at Boston College and of political economy at Cornell University. He is also the author of several books, including An Unwritten Future, Realism and Uncertainty in World Politics, and recently authored an essay in Foreign Affairs in which he compares the nature of American power in the 21st century to that of the Athenian Empire on the eve of the Sicilian expedition in the last decade of the Peloponnesian War. Jonathan and I spend the first half of our conversation today tracing the war's origins alongside his main argument that one of Thucydides' most frequently quoted passages has been used to justify a political worldview that stands in direct opposition to the lesson he intended for us to learn, that great powers are undone less by their rivals than by their own restlessness and hubris, and that prudence rather than gratuitous use of force is the true mark of a durable empire. America's two long wars, the global financial crisis and its latest campaign against Iran, are all, in their own ways, expressions of an imperial power operating without constraint and with little consideration for the national interest. The hollowing out of American domestic institutions and the growth of the unitary executive, the fate of America's alliance networks and international institutions that have underwritten its imperial influence since the Second World War, and the sobering possibility that the forces shaping the trajectory of American empire reside less in any single administration than in the society that produced it, are all themes we grapple with in the second half of this episode. If you want access to the transcripts and intelligence reports for this and other episodes, which include summary sections with key takeaways, you can access those by subscribing to our Super Nerd tier at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. If you want to join in on the conversation and become a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, discounted access to third-party research and analysis, and in-person events like our intimate dinners and weekend retreats, you can also do that on our subscriber page. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. And with that, please enjoy this incredibly inspiring, educational, and timely conversation with my guest, Jonathan Kirshner. Jonathan Kirshner, welcome back to Hidden Forces.
Always a pleasure to be here.
You are one of my favorite recurring guests. Well, I wouldn't have called you a recurring guest actually until today. You were on the podcast some years ago, and then you recently made an appearance in an episode of the 100-Year Pivot that I co-host with Grant Williams. And you're back. You're back in force after having published an article recently in Foreign Affairs titled "The Strong Do What They Can and Suffer What They Must," which is a slightly altered quote pulled from the Melian dialogue within Richard Crawley's translation of Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, which I understand you also teach a course at university. And even that translation, though, is subject to interpretation. Specifically, the words strong and suffer carry more subjective weight in Crawley's translation than may have been intended, but you're the expert, so maybe you'll have a chance to tell us. What inspired you to construct a critique of American foreign policy by leaning on the seemingly inconsequential genocide of a few thousand Aegean islanders in classical Greece?
Well, the question is, why did Thucydides dwell on that? Because, as you said, in the course of this vast war, it is a rather inconsequential event. And yet he stops the action and invents this dialogue. And so it was obviously very important to Thucydides. So we can talk a lot about why it was important to Thucydides, but I want to get back to your larger question about motivations. I'm really enchanted with Thucydides' work, The Peloponnesian War, although I do read it in English and I'm dependent upon translations and commentaries, of which I have read many, but I am not a classicist. I'm a student of international relations. But in my discipline of international relations, most people and most students, although there are very important exceptions, are what I call revolving door Thucydideans, which means they come in with a sentence that says the war was caused by the rise of Athenian power and the fear it invoked in Sparta. And then they skip ahead to the Peloponnesian War, to the Melian dialogue, in which they say the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, 16 years later. And both of those are radically decontextualized. Graham Allison made a book about the so-called Thucydides trap that drew on that first sentence. And most students of international relations in their intro courses are taught that the Melian dialogue actually shows us these things. And both of those are based on shallow, decontextualized readings of this vast and brilliant work. So my motivation to get into Thucydides was to do that. And nowadays, in the US at least, you have many policymakers who are almost strutting about saying, yeah, man, this is how the world works. Thucydides told us this. I mean, they rarely say Thucydides. And so I felt strongly motivated to say, well, actually, that was not what Thucydides was trying to teach us by reporting or inventing this conversation.
So is that the preconception that most of your students come into the course with? And do they get it from Allison's work and his book, Destined for War?
So this predates Allison's book, and I'm going to be a little impolite and say it's not a very good book, but it isn't. And it really does rest on the fact that professors, they can only do so much. I mean, most professors in IR classes don't even bother with Thucydides, but when they do, it's to grab those two sentences. It's to say, look at this. Thucydides could tell 2,500 years ago that changes to the balance of power could cause war, which is not a bad observation to make, but it is really kind of ripped out of its historical context and slapped down, still bleeding, as Stanley Hoffman once said, into settings where it might not be appropriate. And similarly, the Melian dialogue, when I was undergraduate, I had a wonderful professor, but I do remember being taught that this was Thucydides' lesson with the Melian dialogue, that this is what the world is like, and that the strong will do what they will, and the weak will suffer what they must, and that appeals to norms and legitimacy and morality. You know, what you end up when you try to do that is getting massacred. But again, that was not Thucydides' intention with that dialogue, at least in the opinion of the overwhelming majority of people who've devoted their lives to studying this book.
So we'll have a chance to talk about the Melian dialogue in more detail, as well as Graham Allison's political theory and why the lessons he draws from the war may not be the correct ones, in addition to them being ahistorical, since counterintuitively, it was Athens that seemed to be the more reasonable comparison to the US, both because of the nature of its naval empire and the sources of its commercial power than was continental Sparta. But why don't we start with a brief summary of the Peloponnesian War, since we've already established that many in the audience may already be coming to this conversation with some dubious preconceptions about it. When was it fought? Over what duration? Who were the principal counterparties, etc.?
So in broad brush, there was the setting of ancient Greece, and there were two dominant cities, although there were other powers, city powers involved at the time. But Athens and Sparta were recognized as perhaps the two predominant cities, and they had been allies during the earlier Persian wars. And they were rivals, and that rivalry over time developed into this war for lots and lots of proximate reasons, but Thucydides insists that the underlying reason was that Athens was growing stronger and stronger, and that the Spartans were indeed alarmed by this. We can unpack that a lot if you like. And the story, which is told with brilliant narrative nonfiction, is the story of the initial confrontation between Athens and Sparta. They talk about whether or not they should find a compromise. They decide, nah, we both prefer war to compromise. And that war unfolds in three phases. There's a 10-year war that ends with sort of an inconclusive peace that perhaps leans in Athens' favor, and then a 7-year interregnum of kind of jockey for position and scattered fighting. And then the war resumes, and it continues for 10 more years and ends in Athens' unconditional surrender at the hands of Sparta and its allies. Now, Thucydides had the opportunity to write about this war because he was an Athenian general. And early on in the war, he was in charge of an operation that failed. And so he was punished for it. They did that back in the day, often executing generals, but this wasn't really the world's largest failure. So he was just exiled for 10 years. And he was, although we don't know him, apparently a remarkable man. And with time on his hands, he decided he would devote himself to studying and documenting and writing about this war, which he believed would be of epochal importance. And he wrote a masterpiece of a book talking about that war. And as his first important English language translator, Thomas Hobbes, explained, even though he tells the story in a just the facts sort of a way. By narrative techniques, he seeds the work with lessons and ideas that he wants to impart to the readers, which he did say he wanted to provide as a possession for all time.
So let's actually dig into the history of this period a bit, since I think it will be educational for the audience, of course, and for me to probe your mind on it. Before the outbreak of what we think of as the Peloponnesian War around 431 BC, there were a series of clashes between Athens and Sparta's allies, Corinth chief among them, and that period represented the breakdown of what was referred to as the 30 Years' Peace, which lasted for something like 10 years. And it was negotiated after the end of what some scholars refer to now as the First Peloponnesian War, which was preceded by two Persian invasions of Greece, the first by King Darius around 490 BC, I think, and then the second 10 years later by his son Xerxes, who more people might be familiar with because of the popular movie 300 and its depiction of the Battle of Thermopylae, as well as the Battle of Salamis, in which the Athenians used a fleet of triremes that I believe were commissioned by Themistocles, who was another famous politician, was he not, who was ostracized from Athens, if I remember correctly?
I'm not sure. I will have to take your word for it. I am like Thucydides' work memorized. My Greek history outside of that is thinner. And I should also add, I'm a kid from New York, and so I will mispronounce 1,000 Greek names.
Yeah, I'm kind of torn between whether I want to use the English pronunciation or the Greek pronunciation at various times, which would probably annoy people. But so what I think is relevant here is to understand the state of insecurity that the Greek world existed in during the period of the Persian invasions, and how that was foundational to informing the landscape that developed afterwards, which eventually led to the Persian War and the accumulation of power in Athens. Can you lay that out for us?
Well, as I understand it, again, my focus is more on the war that Thucydides spent most of his time discussing, is that Athens and Sparta were important allies during this Persian War, and that Athens was extremely important in bringing about the victory of the Greek city-states over this invasion, and that after the war ended, as international relations scholars will tell us, immediately new political conflicts emerged. Athens initially headed something called the Delian League, which was a loosely affiliated set of alliances, and Sparta had the area that it dominated politically. But Athens' Delian League slowly morphed into what became the Athenian Empire, and it was growing and growing. And over time, Athens, that is, started to irritate some of Sparta's most important allies, in particular the Corinthians. And so even though Thucydides says repeatedly, and there's no doubt that he believed this, that it was the rise of Athenian power that invoked fear in Sparta and led them to commence the war, really, I'm going to finger the Corinthians here. I mean, they're annoyed by Athens who's pushing them around, and they storm over to Sparta, and they say, listen, you guys are sitting there passively doing nothing, and if you don't do something, we're out of here, man. And it's a beautiful debate that takes place in Sparta. They have some Athenians wander by and make a few comments, and the Spartans eventually vote for war. But even though Thucydides' argument is unambiguous, Thucydides' narrative really doesn't show me a scared Sparta. It shows me a Sparta that had to go to war because otherwise its alliance system would have unraveled, and that was unacceptable. So I view the Corinthians as actually the people who caused at least the war in its proximate sense. I guess a true Thucydides would argue that something else would have come along eventually, given these changes in the underlying power dynamics. But that's where you get the underlying war. The Spartans vote for war. Then back in Athens, Pericles rallies a reluctant Athenian public to follow his advice, reject negotiation, and commence war with Sparta, which is one of the many things, again, not to pound on this too much, that Allison's account gets exactly wrong.
So just a quick note for listeners, Jonathan, and then a question. I think you actually highlight this also in your article, which is that Thucydides goes to great lengths to let his readers know that he's doing his best to be as objective as he can, but in certain cases he puts into dialogue what, in his opinion, was demanded of the participants by those occasions, of which the Melian dialogue that we're going to be speaking about appears to be one. My question has to do with military competency. So both Sparta and Athens were experienced in hoplite warfare, but it was the Spartans who were famous for their skill in land-based battles, and the Athenians were, of course, famous for their navies and their naval power. What's important for us to understand militarily about these two city-states, and how did this influence the nature of their societies and their political systems?
Well, Athens was the masters of the sea. This was their specialization, and it was a trading city, and they had the largest navy, but also they had easily the most skilled navy. And so they had no peer with regard to a naval challenger. And again, Sparta was more dominant on the land. I'm not an expert in military strategy, so I cannot get into the weeds of the specifics of how they fought, but this was an odd confrontation, and it led to their strategies when the war started. Sparta wanted to draw out Athens into large land battles, and Athens cleverly said, no, I don't think that's a good idea for us. And they retreated behind their city walls and tried a strategy of waiting Sparta out while annoying them with kind of naval raiding missions along the coastline and things like that. This was Pericles' original strategy. It was unpopular among many Greeks because the Spartans were having their way on land and laying waste to various territories, and the people were getting agitated. And Pericles would not budge on this strategy. And in fact, there's one amusing anecdote in the book where they want to hold a meeting so they can yell at him, and he kind of leaves town and says, yeah, we're not going to have a meeting today, and lets the public cool off. So it was an interesting confrontation between two very different styles of power and also two very different polities. Athens, for its time, with limitations, was a democracy, and Sparta was, they had a oligarchic leadership that wasn't a singular dictatorship, but they were, as the word might say, more Spartan in their approach to things.
So were either of these city-states more disliked than the other? And if so, was it Sparta or was it Athens, would you say?
Well, this is something that Thucydides wants to teach us, which is that one of the consequences of the rise of Athenian power was that Athens got a little arrogant and started kicking people around. And he has this beautiful sentence that at the start of the war, men's feelings inclined toward Sparta. And again, that was because of the way in which Athens had been comporting itself for the past few decades. And so this is a very important political lesson, right? Actions have consequences. War takes place in a political context. And Athens had torched a lot of goodwill by morphing from the head of an alliance toward the rather assertive head of what was clearly an empire.
So I think we should probably fast forward to the Melian dialogue, but I do want to ask you at some point about Pericles and Pericles' strategy, which you alluded to, as well as his last speech, in which he invokes a word that comes up often in Thucydides' history of the war, which is hatred, and specifically the hatred of those over whom Athens has ruled its empire, which he calls a tyranny, and that Athenians should be more afraid of what those people will do to them than what they may have to endure in a war with Sparta, which relates directly to the case that Cleon makes for the annihilation and enslavement of the inhabitants of Mytilene after their rebellion in the 5th year of the war, which you juxtapose to the Melian dialogue and the decision to annihilate their society. Tell us where that fits into your understanding of Athens' progression over the course of the war and why you made it central to your foreign affairs article.
Sure. Well, again, the main reason why I brought it up in the piece is because it is so often invoked all the time, almost everywhere, at least if you travel in kind of IR circles. And I do think it's generally misused. So it fits in the very end of that 7-year interregnum that I talked about. Milos had always been on Athens' radar screen as a small island in the Aegean, or a mid-sized island. It was vaguely neutral. It wasn't really actively involved in the fighting, but it was technically an ally of Sparta. Athens had kind of sailed along and kicked some sand in Milos's face earlier in the war. But then here we are in year 16 or 17, and Thucydides stops the action in its tracks, and Athens comes and invests the island and sends some emissaries, and that's where this famous dialogue takes place, and says, the emissaries say to the Melians, and this is conducted in private behind closed doors, because there's a lot of interesting politics going on both sides, and says, look, just surrender to us, or we will lay waste to you all. We will kill all the men, enslave the women and children, and repopulate the island. And the Melians say, oh, come on, we're not any problem for you guys. Why can't we just remain quietly neutral? And Athens says, no, you must submit and surrender and be vassals of our rule. The Melian representatives in this conversation, maybe they don't speak for the population as a whole, but they go the full Cleon. They say, death before dishonor. We will not surrender and be vassals. We've been around for a long time and we want to live in freedom. And after a while, it turns out Milos was not quite the pushover they seem to be, and also involving a little intrigue within Milos that is underdefined for us by Thucydides. Athens does finally defeat Milos and carries out that massacre and then just moves on. Now, again, what's really interesting about this is that it is irrelevant for the war, and it is not a novel event. We have seen many, many such massacres in the war quickly described to us by Thucydides at different points in the narrative. But here, he stops the narrative in its tracks and has this dialogue and has it end, and then he moves on to a very important event in the war, actually what he thought was the single most important event of the war, Athens' misguided attempt to conquer Sicily. In fact, the sentences connect. I know I'm rambling a bit here, but people who read the book today read it in book form, that it comes in 8 books. Thucydides did not write in books. That was an intervention of his later translators. He wrote in years and seasons. And since the laying to waste of Milos and the embarking on the Sicilian campaign took place in the same season, the last sentence killed all the men, enslaved all the women and children, and repopulated the island. The next sentence is, then the Athenians turned to conquer Sicily. And so the linkages of those two events is going on there. And again, it really remains a fascinating puzzle. Why does Thucydides stop the action and invent a new form? There's no other dialogue in the entire book to talk about this trivial event in the overall course of the war. It was very important to Thucydides, and I don't think we need it to be told the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. First of all, the Athenians said that in their meeting at the Spartan assembly 16 years earlier. And secondly, we see that happening over and over and over again in the narrative. So there's no news here in the fact that this happened. So it's inconsequential for the war. It's not novel, and it tells us nothing we haven't heard before. And it's a new dialogue form, and it's likely Thucydides had to invent a lot of this because he does not name the Athenian emissaries, and often for important speeches, the speakers are named, and the Melian participants, also unnamed, they were probably massacred, in the war. So at best, he gets secondhand fragments of this conversation, and so the dialogue itself must be reconstructed in Thucydides' mind, and therefore, line for line, it has many things that Thucydides wants to tell us.
And what is your argument for why he included that and went into such detail? And is there anything important that we need to understand about how the war was going up until that point?
I think the former more than the latter. And I do want to be very clear. I am a student of this literature. I mean, I do teach a seminar on the Peloponnesian War, but again, it's in translation. So what I want to say is this is not me. This is what I have gleaned from what classicists have taught us. And classicists suggest that there are 3 plausible reasons. I don't think they compete with each other. I think they're all right as to why the Melian dialogue was so important to Thucydides. And so one of them I've already mentioned, which is it wants to link Athenian arrogance at Milos, and boy, are they arrogant, with their comeuppance in Sicily. And so the appeal for Thucydides of the Melian dialogue or the massacre at Milos, as opposed to the massacre at Scion that took place 5 years earlier, that he covers in one sentence, is that he can use that narrative technique of linking these events and saying Milos and Sicily are somehow linked. And so the linkage between Milos and the Sicilian catastrophe, both rooted in Athenian hubris, are one reason why scholars who study Thucydides say the Melian dialogue is so important. But there are 2 other really interesting reasons. Thucydides was a really interesting, we would call him today a social theorist. And he had so many lessons he wished to impart to us. And one of them was, he uses the phrase that people repeat a lot, which is war is a harsh teacher. And that's a nice phrase, but I think Thucydides had a lot more to say about war than that. Time and time again in the book, Thucydides is, I'm going to use the word anxious about the fragility of civilization and how war can actually contribute to the undermining of civilized behavior. And so other classicists have said, what's interesting about Milos is how it contrasts with Athenian behavior toward Mytilene, which is earlier in the war. Mytilene, which I hope I'm coming close to pronouncing correctly.
Mytilene.
Thank you. Was a valued ally of Athens who was treated fairly well. However, even they were irritated by Athens, and so they tried to undertake what we could call an unspeakable betrayal. They reached out to Sparta and said, guys, maybe we should switch sides in this war. But the Athenians get wind of this. They suppress that because of their naval dominance. They're able to swiftly get over there and crush that attempt. And then they have a conversation at home as to what to do about it. And they say, you know what we should do to these guys? We should just lay waste to them. We should go out there and kill them all, do what we would eventually do in Milos, although they don't phrase it that way. And there's a debate with the demagogue Cleon, who Thucydides did not much like, and he holds the day. But then they wake up the next morning, the Athenians, as Thucydides report, and reflect upon, quote, so horrid an act that they were contemplating. And they have another debate and another vote, and they decide, no, we should just go there and kill the people who are responsible for this and not lay waste to the entire population of this entity. And it's a beautifully told story because one ship had already been sent with the orders to do this, but as Thucydides says, tasked with so horrid an errand. Again, that's a little editorializing there by Thucydides, right? They were kind of tarrying a bit, and the second ship was so desperate to stop them, they slept in shifts and they ate while they rode, and they overtook them at the last minute and stopped that horrible massacre from taking place. So another reason why some say Thucydides stops the action to dwell on Milos is that Milos is a trivial backwater, irrelevant for the war, and yet Athens decides to reflexively massacre them all for no good reason. In fact, Milos may have had irritated Athens in some way, but Thucydides withholds that in his narrative. He doesn't say anything about what Milos might have done to annoy the Athenians. So all you have is flat out massacre. And so that contrast shows the hardening of the war, that earlier in the war, Athens was still the kind of civilization that would not simply reflexively lay waste to another society, even one that it had good reason to be furious with. Whereas late in the war, after 16 or 17 years of war, it was simply reflexively barbaric. So that's a second reason why some classical scholars find the Melian dialogue so interesting and why Thucydides dwells on it. Then there's a third reason. The Melians make a lot of great points in the debate. If you do this, people are going to notice and they're going to kind of politically shy away from you. And they were exactly right in that. I mean, the Melians may have been destroyed, but as a debating team, they kicked butt. They made all the good points in this debate. But they also said, Athenians, you have an interest in not setting the precedent that someone who loses a war gets massacred. Now, Thucydides did not live or did not complete. He lived to see the end of the war, but he did not live to complete his work. It breaks off about 7 years before the conclusion of the war, and the narrative is kind of picked up by Xenophon. And Xenophon reports that, after the Athenians unconditionally surrender, there's a discussion by Sparta, and many of Sparta's allies are saying, yes, give Athens the full Milos. These are bad guys, and you should kill them all. And I think Donald Kagan has the line, the classical scholar, they were right to be concerned about this. This was on the table, right? They could have easily been completely massacred, and luckily for them, they were not. The classical scholar Hunter Rawlings makes a necessarily speculative, but to my eyes, very convincing argument that Thucydides wrote his book in a very parallel way, that things that happen in the first half of the book have parallels in the second half of the book. And Rawlings speculates that the Melian dialogue was so important because it was going to parallel the so-called Athenian dialogue that would have taken place at the end of the war. And that has a really attractive symmetry to it. And these things did come up, as Xenophon reports, in the discussion of what to do with the Athenians. And Rawlings also makes the point, as do many other classical scholars, that no one in Thucydides' original audience, remember, he was writing for all time, but his first readers had memories of this war. And that would have not been lost on them. The fact that they came very close to being massacred in the way that the Athenians massacred the Melians. So that parallel is very attractive. So those are the three big reasons, I think, why classical scholars have said Thucydides just stops the narrative in its tracks and has this invented dialogue to make all these points. And also, again, I think the Melians make a lot of good political points along the way. So that's interesting to me, too, as an IR person. But to bring it all back home, if we may now invoke Bob Dylan, so it is much, much more than that one line. The strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must, and much, much more than some lesson that, look, this is what can happen in world politics. You can have all the morals on your side that you want, but force will rule and you'll still get massacred. Again, as I've already said in our discussion, we see examples of that littered throughout the text many times. Often Thucydides dwells on them. Other times he gives it a sentence. Again, the Scion comparison is so fascinating because as I understand the Greek, and I don't, but as I'm told, he uses the exact same language to describe the massacre of the Athenians at Scion, but he does it in one sentence. And other classical historians have described the Melian episode in one sentence because it wasn't important for the war. And so it got a sentence and they moved on. Again, the Melian dialogue was really important to Thucydides because he wanted to teach us things.
Fantastic. All right, let's unpack this a bit. So you made an allusion to the Athenian dialogue, which would have been part of this arc, this literary arc of Thucydides had he completed his histories. That would have presumably been the Athenians pleading their case to the Spartans after the Spartans won the war, right?
Yes, yes.
Now, if I'm going heavily off memory here, and there are many dialogues, so this can easily get confusing, but if I remember correctly, it was during the dialogue between the Athenian envoys and their Melian counterparts, where the Athenians, echoing Pericles' warning about the hatred of those over whom Athens rules, stated that it isn't the Spartans that they're worried about, or what would happen to them at the hands of the Spartans should they lose the war, but rather what would happen to them should they be overpowered by their subjects or those over whom they rule their empire. Now, there's also another dialogue that we've already alluded to here, in which you bring up in your Foreign Affairs article, which is the Mytilene debate that happens in Athens in 427 BC, where two opposing arguments are made, one by Cleon, and these are appeals to the Athenian people at the assembly, and one of them is by Cleon, who, again, echoing Pericles, says something to the effect of, your empire is a tyranny against those who plot against you, or something like that, and that you would be fools not to make examples out of the Mytileans, as it would only invite future rebellions. So be merciless, essentially. And the counter-argument is made by Diodotus, who doesn't make a moral argument against genocide, but rather makes a very rational argument which rests on two stools, one of which is destroying Mytilene would mean the loss of an important revenue stream for the Athenian Empire. And the second was that killing everyone, including the innocent, which is what was being proposed by Cleon, would make it less likely that future rebellions would be stopped because the inhabitants would see no benefit to trying to cut a deal, since no deal could be had. So here we have what is a very cynical argument for preventing a genocide, and what appear to be a series of examples, very instructive examples for how the Athenians view their empire and how they perceive the perception of those over whom they hold power. How important is that for us to understand if we really want to understand the nature of Athenian empire?
Well, the whole story is really cool, and it's really cool because of Thucydides' narrative techniques. In fact, there were two debates over this. I'm going to keep saying Mytilene because my language is bad. And Thucydides withholds from us the first debate. Just like in the debate over the start of the war, Thucydides says, many speakers arose to take sides on whether to have the war. But all he gives us is Pericles' pro-war speech, right? So Thucydides is constantly putting his finger on the scale in that way. By allowing Pericles to speak alone, he really gives a lot of weight to Pericles' words, even though there were opponents of the war that actually held the majority in the very beginning of that debate. Pericles' speech won the people over, as Thucydides writes at the time, because they were convinced by the wisdom of his advice. Again, contra Allison's understanding of what happened there. But in final line, sorry for the mispronunciation once again, there were two debates. I radically speculate with no evidence that in the first debate, Diodotus actually made an appeal based in morality. And Cleon said, kill them all. And they lost that debate, and the decision was made to kill them all. And then Thucydides only gives us the second debate, in which Cleon says, as you described, it's politics, man. We need to crush these mothers to scare the hell out of people and make sure they understand if you mess with us, this is what's going to happen. And Diodotus says, look, I'm not going to make any kind of moral argument. And that's why I think this is where he must have, or I think, made one the day before. He says, I'm going to make a narrowly interest-based argument. And let's just talk about the politics of this. What will be the political consequences of you doing this? And again, for reasons you've already articulated, in his view, I share that view, in the longer run, the political implications of Athens behaving that way would lead still more actors to lean away from Athens. And again, war is politics. And so if you're fighting a war and you get everybody in the arena disenchanted with you and rooting against you, that's not a good thing for your political power and influence and your prospects in the war itself. But we do have this second debate, the only one we're given, in which we have two competing political debates about the use of force. One says we must demonstrate our terrifying hand so that nobody will ever dare mess with us in this way ever again. And the other to say you will create more enemies than friends by doing this sort of thing. And that is a lesson that Thucydides repeats in the book. Again, Thucydides only rarely speaks in his own voice. He's very clever about that. But he does time and time again have people make this observation about how certain horrifying acts tend to backfire because of their political implications, even if they win the day in the immediate military battle.
So what are the lessons that we should draw, not just from this dialogue, but from the larger history of the Peloponnesian War as told to us by Thucydides?
So in my view, we mostly think about the grand lesson of the Peloponnesian War incorrectly. I don't think the lesson of the Peloponnesian War is that the rise in Athenian power, and the fear it instilled in Sparta caused the war, and that was some sort of tragedy or crisis. In fact, everything indicates that Thucydides supported that initial war. He was a huge admirer of Pericles. And again, you have that phrase that the crowd was persuaded by the wisdom of his advice. Those are Thucydides' words. And he even at times seems to hang the entire Athenian loss in the war on the passing of Pericles from the scene, suggesting that if Pericles had remained in power and not been killed in the plague, and that his strategy was followed throughout, that Athens would have emerged more victorious in that conflict. So the tragedy is not in that rise of Athenian power bit, although it's good IR theory for Thucydides to observe that changes to the balance of power are destabilizing and can cause wars. I like that as a lesson. But there are 30 or 40 lessons in this book that you can glean from it. That's why it rewards such careful reading. But what is the book really about? And again, I think Thucydides has a great emphasis on the fragility of civilization. It comes up over and over again throughout the war. But what is the denouement? What is the central set piece of the work? And it is the Sicilian campaign, the description of which takes up about a quarter of the entire book. And it comes right after Milos, and it was the opposite of what Pericles had advocated for. And it was a terrible idea. And Nicias, maybe not the world's greatest general, but there was a debate about whether to go on and try and conquer Sicily. He speaks in what sounds to me like Thucydides' voice, in which he says, guys, this is crazy. And he has a great line about how you go and seek out enemies elsewhere while you still got some pretty serious enemies here. This is a very bad idea. He fails in that debate. That part of the war is the catastrophe for Athens, is the central set piece of the war. And therefore, I believe, if I had to say what the singular most important lesson of the Peloponnesian War was, the danger of great power hubris. That great powers are not undermined or destroyed by shifts in the balance of power so much as they are undermined by their own arrogance. And if there's a lesson, it's that great powers need to be alert to the fact that they get very arrogant and eventually bite off more than they can chew. And so I think that's, if he was only reduced to being able to give us one lesson, although I do think the civilization thing is very important to him, it would be that, which would be, what us old school realists come to call prudence, great power prudence, right? Not pacifism, right? Thucydides was a general. He led men into battle. He had the values of, Greeks from 2,500 years ago. He didn't shy away from war. Oh, war, that's horrifying. Rather, it had to do with war in its political context. Again, that's kind of centuries and centuries later, but it's very Clausewitzian, right? What are your political objectives? How will the introduction of the use of force help you advance those political objectives? But the political objectives must always predominate. You don't destroy things for the sake of destroying them. That repeatedly rubbed Thucydides the wrong way, the gratuitous exercise of violence. So how war can undermine a society and how great powers, the gravest threat to a great power is their own arrogance and hubris, I think is the grand lesson of the Peloponnesian War. Although, again, I think Thucydides has a lot of lessons to give us in a brilliantly written book.
Do you see some of those same parallels between the United States and Athens?
Yes, definitely.
And do you also feel that war has undermined American democracy and the United States in similar ways?
Well, we have to be cautious here because the U.S. hasn't fought the type of war that is as massive as the Peloponnesian War. And so the links there are not direct. There are two links that I would want to call attention to that I think are important and indirect, which is, especially in the second Trump administration, we are governed or ruled, I guess they would prefer ruled, I'm going to say governed, by an administration that holds the more Cleon type view that the world is a jungle and the way you succeed in it is by the uninhibited use of force without hesitation, and that if you use it in that way, people will be cowed and they will submit to you. I think the track record on that is mixed. I mean, maybe it works in Venezuela. Venezuela is not what you'd call a peer competitor, but it's not going to work elsewhere. But I think when you think about American society in a larger sense, one of my great teachers, Robert Gilpin, wrote, and he was not someone who liked to mix it up in contemporary politics. He very rarely spoke to current events. But as the Iraq War in 2003 approached, he wrote an essay in which he said presciently and brilliantly that this war, which he thought was a ridiculous idea, will have consequences for the nature of American society that we have not even begun to comprehend. And it did. I mean, the two long wars that the U.S. fought did not threaten the physical integrity and security of the United States, but it did contribute to the larger hollowing out of American society that we've seen in the 21st century. Now, we could also throw in the global financial crisis and its aftermath. But if you look at those 2 decades of the 21st century, we do see American society paying the price for hubristic behavior. The idea that, well, we'll just go, knock off Iran and remake society, and everyone will see our power, be awed by it, and the world will be a better place. Now, it was pretty easy to knock off the Iraqi military in 2003, and that's not surprising, but it's harder to remake a society. And so, in retrospect, that vision of, we'll do this, and again, shock and awe, it was the expression of the day, that the entire region would be transformed by the exercise of American power, that was wrong. And even the Afghan war, the U.S. on paper, it looks a tad stronger than Afghanistan, I will say, making a little joke there. But, the Afghans weren't going anywhere, right? All they had to do was stay where they were long enough and resist American power, and eventually the Americans would leave. You could argue over how long they should have waited before they leave, but they were going to go before the Afghans were going to go because, again, the Afghans lived there. So you had these two long losing wars, both rooted in the idea that we are the hyperpower. We have the capacity to do this. We will impose our will and get what we want. That's not what happened, but also, as Gilpin and others pointed out at the time, the prosecution of those wars and who fought them and how they were fought and what happened when those soldiers came home had a deleterious effect on American society more generally. And again, I would combine that with the global financial crisis, which was also brought about in part by an act of American hubris. The American hyperpower of the late 1990s said, we believe in financial global liberalization and we will impose it on you because we know it's the right thing. Well, actually, it wasn't the right thing, but the arrogance of that power, those things that the U.S. did also contributed to that crisis, and it was another way in which you had a sort of hubristic overreach. So it was a bad couple of decades for America in this century, and both of those problems, I think, were rooted in that arrogance and that hubris. And so in that sense, it links up very nicely to Thucydides' warning about what will undo a great power. And what will undo a great power is not being overtaken by adversaries. It will be undone by the mistakes it makes with the full head of steam of its own arrogance and hubris.
I'm not a scholar of this period. Obviously, I'm not a classicist, so I may be misremembering here. But as I recall, the Sicilian expedition came after a prolonged period of frustration on the part of Athens at its inability to conclude the war. Of course, the strategy that Pericles had put forward at the beginning of the war was one of retreat into the city walls and relying on the Spartans to eventually exhaust themselves, which hadn't occurred or not occurred fast enough to satisfy the Athenians. And so the Sicilian expedition was, in some sense, it seems to me, at least from my remembrance of it, a way of fighting a war on Athens' terms and in a manner that could disrupt the status quo, that for a restless city-state like Athens, I mean, what was that quote by the Corinthians that the Athenians are restless so they cannot give rest to anyone else?
Yeah,
that also seems to be a parallel. You know, our restlessness. We're always looking for enemies. We're always looking for regimes to change. We cannot rest. We cannot let the world rest. And that's what this administration in particular has felt like to me. It's felt like a ceaseless percussion of conflict and chaos and now war. And so I wonder, do you feel that as well? And do you see a parallel there between the restlessness of the Athenians and their frustration and impatience over the inconclusion of the war and their need to overturn the status quo with American restlessness during its period of hegemony and its time as a hyperpower, whether that be in efforts to effectuate regime change in Iraq or Syria or now in Iran? I mean, we seem to continue to create problems for ourselves. And the more we move in response to this restlessness, the faster we seem to be sinking, such that, yes, to your point, we didn't transform the Middle East the way we intended as a result of our inability to exercise patience and, above all, humility, but we certainly transformed it, just not for the better.
Yeah. Yes. I want to be very cautious about how much I can say to try and unpack the logic of the current administration's behavior. In that, I'm an IR theorist, and I think in a different project, unrelated to the Thucydides stuff I've been talking about, I think that my discipline of international relations is facing what I call a second crisis in IR theory. I don't think we have good off-the-shelf explanations to explain the behavior of the United States in its foreign policy at this time. It is idiosyncratic. It is not obviously pursuing any definition of the American national interest that most IR scholars would draw up. Its behavior, again, seems to be causing more enemies than friends, even if you agree with some of the underlying instincts of the ways in which the administration is trying to slightly rejigger the American orientation in its grand strategy. The way it is going about it is absolutely illogical and catastrophic. And I call it a second crisis in IR theory because we had one before. My discipline did not do a good job anticipating the end of the Cold War and understanding the way in which the Cold War ended. And that was a big crisis for my discipline of IR theory back then. And there were some really good debates where they said, we really got to think about this and how we can better be IR scholars, since we really missed a big one here. Didn't see it coming and didn't end the way we kind of thought it would end, and it happened very suddenly. Similarly, the behavior of the United States right now does not fall into accord with any of our existing theories. In different writings I've explained, some people call this realism. We can talk about this, but I think we've already talked about this in the other podcast. Trust me, as a card-carrying realist, this is not realism by any stretch of the imagination. Is it a personalist kleptocracy? Is it what Steve Walt called predatory hegemony? Is it what other scholars have called neo-royalism? Whatever it is, we don't have an existing theory to explain this type of bizarre and counterproductive behavior. So I really got to say I just can't do that. But with regard to Thucydides, I do think the observation you made about the restlessness of the Athenians is an important one. And one of the many, many wonderful lessons that Thucydides has to pass down to us is, even in the Sicilian debate, but in the debates throughout the war, it's always the young, arrogant men who are the troublemakers. And so the war had been going on for a while, and there hadn't been many glorious victories. And so when they were debating the Sicilian campaign, it was generally the older folks who said, this may not be a good idea. But the younger members of society wanted more a taste of that action and glory. And that drive, that very Athenian drive, really won the day in that debate. So many people have observed that Athenian restlessness. And as you already observed, when the Corinthians go to Sparta and yell at the Spartans and say, you guys just sit there and do nothing, whereas the Athenians are constantly on the go and they're doing this, they're doing that. It really was, the war has also been well described as a conflict between two distinct national characters, right? You do have this American national character, which tends to want it to do big things, right? If you see a problem, you can do it. And also, the absence of constraints allows it to do such things, right? Why could the U.S. fight the Vietnam War the way it did? Why could the U.S. fight the Iraq War the way it did? Because it had massive amounts of power and no obvious nearby security threats. That's a very rare combination, and I think Thucydides would tell us that often leads to making big mistakes. The lack of constraints, right? Having a peer military competitor can actually be very tempering of your behavior, because you really have to prioritize what is actually important to you and to the so-called national interest.
That's a great point. And I don't know that I would describe China as a peer competitor, or certainly not Russia. But the United States finds itself in a more operationally constrained geopolitical environment today than it did in 2003. What explains its behavior in light of that fact? In other words, it doesn't seem, we're back in the Middle East again.
Yes.
After a generation. There's just a little over 20 years since the onset of the Iraq War, and we are back in an intractable conflict. Obviously, we don't have troops on the ground. It's not comparable to Iraq in that sense. We're back into a situation where we went into the war with an intention to effectuate change. Not entirely clear what we wanted, at least not from the public statements. And now we're back in the situation where we did all this damage. We've changed the dynamic, and it's not clear whether we're even going to stick around or just walk away. And so what explains that behavior, especially if you want to add to it the politics, which is that the Trump administration ran explicitly on no new foreign wars?
So, what explains this again? IR theory is in a lot of trouble here. If you look either from a realist perspective, but we don't get to bog down into subdisciplinary debates, but just in a perspective of the American national interest, most scholars looking at the American national interest would say, gosh, the U.S. is relatively less powerful vis-a-vis China than it was 10, 20 years ago, certainly. And if there is a threat, I'm going to phrase it more as a political threat than as an active military threat that's emerging on the horizon, it is China. And so if the U.S. has limited resources and more challenges, it really needs to think about prioritizing things. I'm really not aware of a scholar who says things like that. And if you wrote it up on a blackboard, you'd say, from where should we pull back? And from where should we pull back? The answer is exactly the Middle East, right? And maybe it made sense to defend Persian Gulf oil in the 1970s when the world was so dependent on it, and the U.S. was, very much an energy importer. Now the U.S. is one of the world's largest energy exporters. The Persian Gulf is much less important to the United States than it has been in the last half century, easily. So if you want to rejigger your forces, you should be getting out of the Middle East and shifting some resources towards bolstering your position in East Asia. I don't think to have a war, I'm not shopping for a war with China, but again, back to politics, back to the way George Kennan would look at this. What you need to do is give like-minded powers and your political and military allies in the region the confidence that you're going to stay engaged so that they will have the confidence to resist China's dominance as it becomes increasingly powerful in the region. So investing more in the Middle East, again, is a bizarre choice. It cannot be explained by any off-the-shelf IR theories. It can be explained a little bit if you think of the U.S. government as a personalist kleptocracy. I mean, it is a matter of fact. And I know that many people would say, oh, this is just Trump derangement syndrome. But no, not to recognize this is Trump delusion syndrome. This is the singularly most overtly corrupt presidential administration in American history, full stop. And the behaviors are astonishing. And if you had written them down in advance and said, would the president do that? You would say, oh my God, not a chance. Would President Biden or Obama sell cryptocurrency from the White House and make $1 billion doing it? I mean, these are beyond the imagination. So if you start to think of the U.S. foreign policy as run by a coterie of kleptocratic leaders, then the Middle East is a place where they have a lot of personal business interests. And so not from the U.S. national interest, but from the kind of personalist interests, staying involved in the Middle East, it has a little more of a logic to it. But for U.S. foreign policy, it's absolutely catastrophic. One is, it does reveal the limits of what bombarding a country can do, especially a large country. If you wanted to take out Iran, you probably would have to put boots on the ground. And I don't think that would work either. It's a very large country. I think that would be a terribly stupid idea, but it's just not going to happen from the air, even with our impressive air might. And we have depleted many of our most important munitions in that effort. The types of munitions that my Asian studies scholars tell me we had been building up with an eye towards a possible military confrontation in Asia. So if Asia is where the action is, we've really undermined our position there with this, I'm going to reach for the word ridiculous, Iran war. And so again, IR theory cannot explain it. But if we get into theories of what is motivating this particular administration and stop thinking about the national interest and start thinking about the personalist interest, then we can at least, through the weeds, see some logics to this behavior. But even then, it's hard to explain. It's hard to explain why to this morning or this afternoon in Europe, the president of the United States would announce that Spain is a country of losers who he wants nothing to do with and should cut off all trade with. I mean, you may want to take a tougher line with Europe on international trade or be irritated with European support for NATO, but that's just not the way a thoughtful strategist would comport themselves.
So I do want to ask you about our alliance networks. One question before I do that. The way I learned about the Watergate scandal and the resignation of Richard Nixon and Barry Goldwater and the Republicans coming up to the White House was that there came a point where the revelations of the break-in at the Watergate Hotel and the subsequent cover-up became too much for institutional Washington to allow and for the Republican Party to allow. And so Nixon had to go. That institutional integrity seems to be missing today. And my question is, was it always missing? If not, what explains this? There seems as though there's been a hollowing out of the institutions and also corruption of our culture as a nation.
I think you're exactly right about all of those things. I do want to pause to make a public service announcement. which is Vice President Vance said that Watergate would be a 12-hour story today. And I need to add that what J.D. Vance doesn't know about Watergate could fill stadiums. This was a very big deal. It was not about the break-in. It was about a vaster range of crimes by the executive branch. I'm not going to dive into that here, but you can read up on this. It was a very, very big deal. I mean, not perhaps what we see done on a daily basis today, but in the context of the political behavior in American history, it was unprecedented. It was a constitutional crisis. It was a very big deal. And finally, as you said, Goldwater, Mr. Conservative, goes to the president and says, this is enough. And what was being invoked there was something we have lost, which was the phrase I would use is institutions defending their institutional prerogatives. And I do think we've lost that. And I do think that is also sort of unprecedented. Even if you were, say, a Democratic president dealing with a Democratic Speaker of the House, you did not mess with the authority of the Speaker of the House on the things that the Speaker of the House thought was the business of the House of Representatives. And similarly, the Senate. Today, we have a Speaker of the House who serves at the pleasure of the president. So this is kind of shattering the notion that we have these distinct epicenters of authority throughout society, with the three branches of government, for example. It is shocking to me the extent to which our legislative institutions and our judiciary, for that matter, at the highest levels, has ceded its authority as a peer institutional power of this executive branch. I don't understand why that has happened. It probably roots to the underlying dysfunctional crisis of American society today. That something has happened internally that has brought that about. But it's mind-boggling. It is mind-boggling that the House and the Senate do not insist upon asserting their institutional prerogatives. I mean, you try and tell LBJ when he was the Senate Majority Leader that you wanted this to happen over his objections, and he would have eaten you for lunch, Democrat or Republican. Whereas nowadays, again, not only is that not happening, but you have a Supreme Court that has immunized the president. I feel fairly confident that if the Supreme Court had immunized the president in 1970, all of the crimes that Nixon committed during Watergate, and they were crimes, if any of us committed them, we'd be behind bars right now. They would say, well, it's president. He's above the law, as the Supreme Court now tells us. And so part of the current American civilizational crisis has come from the renunciation of authority by otherwise co-equal branches of government.
So, Jonathan, last question for you, and that has to do with our alliance structures. Much of what we talked about today has been military power. And of course, military power is elemental, but so much of how America has wielded power since the end of the Second World War has been what we call soft power. It's been through the institutions that we created after the end of that war. I mean, one parallel with the conversation we were having earlier is the Dealing League. The United States seems to be undoing many of those institutions, if not literally, certainly tacitly, or if not explicitly, certainly tacitly. What are the consequences to our alliance networks and to those sources of American power? And can any of that damage be undone after the end of this administration?
It will not be easy to undo the damage because everybody around the world has to understand that this is what the American political system can produce, especially with the re-election of Trump, right? That means the American public wasn't kidding. This is what America must look like to the rest of the world. And even if the next president looks different, it doesn't matter in that we know that America can easily produce this. And again, IR theory, it's a world of anarchy. You have to make assessments about the behavior of other actors in the system. And so assessments of what the U.S. may or may not do must now change everywhere in the world. Now, I want to make a few qualifications to this. I'm among those who bemoaned the end of the American order. I did it in print. But many of my colleagues pointed out to me, Well, everything ends, right? That order was forged 75 years ago. It's not shocking that we had a certain order and that order came to a close. It's really about how the order ends and what replaces it. And so you could also have good IR debates about the nature of the relationship between the U.S. and its European allies. It's understandable that the U.S. has expressed frustration for decades that Europe has not done more for its own self-defense. That's certainly a good debate to have. But what we don't have an understanding of as to why the U.S. would torch its alliances.
That's right. That's a good word to use.
Yeah, and turn former intimate friends into, at best, diffident affiliates, but perhaps even ultimately in the long run, adversaries, if you push it along the way, who look at the U.S. with wariness and suspicion. Again, I'm going to quote Bob Dylan again, because I love to quote Bob Dylan. We live in a political world. Politics rules. Most of the time, we're not deciding things by wars. We're deciding things by political contestation. And so shedding your allies and behaving in a way that makes everybody in the world not like you is simply politically unwise. But there's also, and this may be even the grandest failure of this administration, how credible are U.S. commitments to other countries? And this is the big, big question in East Asia, because the question on the table in East Asia is not, is China going to invade us all and swallow us up? It's rather, is China's power going to mean that its political will ultimately be irresistible and that China will come to politically dominate almost all of East Asia? And a lot of the calculations that the states of that region have to make is, can we push back against that political dominance? And part of that will depend on whether they think the U.S. will be an engaged partner in East Asia should push come to shove. I think the U.S. is behaving in the world like a bully, and most bullies, when confronted, tend to back down. And I think a lot of actors in East Asia have to wonder if there actually does break out a war in the region. Will the U.S. show up, or will it throw a few punches and then scurry back home? And again, maybe the U.S. won't do that. Maybe the U.S. will do that. It is on the table that the U.S. may not be a trustworthy political and military partner. And that is something that will not easily be repaired.
Well said. And even if the U.S. does show up, I don't know how relevant that is. Because to your larger point, I think the U.S. has proven itself to be an untrustworthy ally and one with which you cannot reliably collaborate. So even if you are of the view that this latest war was taken on behalf of Israel, the American administration has wavered so many times throughout the course of the war and been so often at public odds with the Israeli prime minister and has entertained conclusions of the conflict that would put the Israelis in a worse position than they were at the start of the conflict, that even in such cases where you'd think the U.S. is working on behalf of an ally or partner, they're not, or they're not doing so reliably. And the same thing has been true of its relationship to the Europeans and NATO. So the larger question, or I would say one of the larger questions, is what conclusions can we draw about the future of American foreign policy from this administration that can be applied to the next one? How much of this is a deeper expression of the polity's will, and how much of it is a unique facet of this particular administration, which I grant you it's unique. I mean, lots of presidents are corrupt, but this one, he isn't just corrupt. He's engaged in a kind of corruption that seems inexplicable for a man of his age who is creating enmity for his family that cannot be justified by the billions of dollars that he's been able to extract through these various forms of grift and corruption. So it's hard to understand. I mean, I think in some sense he really is a cinematic figure, and so much of what he does is a visceral expression of his deepest animal instincts combined with his sense of stage presence and his always on, I always got to keep the ducks quacking and keep the ratings up mentality. And I feel like that constant need to generate attention and keep the attention on him explains a lot of what he does. You know, I don't know. I don't know if you have any other things you'd like to add, Jonathan, or closing thoughts before we wrap it up, but those are mine.
Yes, I have several closing thoughts about that. One is that Trump's behavior is consequential and it will not be good for the U.S. The U.S. will leave the Trump administration a lonelier and less politically influential entity on the world stage. But now I want to say something a little strange, which is I think Trump is analytically irrelevant. I mean, obviously, I'm not a fan, but what's important as an IR person about Trump is not what he does, but the fact of the society that has produced him. I think the real problem rests within something that has happened in American society. And we've already talked about the institutional erosion. You talked about the making billions. Another powerful entity that has rolled over is our plutocratic class, right? Most of our billionaires sort of shied away from Trump initially and now have rolled over and are on board. I was at a workshop recently in which it was at a place where people, some of them knew billionaires, and they say, every billionaire now wants to be a trillionaire. And this is mind-boggling to me. It's like, I feel like if I had $50 billion, I'd be kind of good with the cash. My goal in life would not be to chase ever more wealth. And so this is another difference, I think, in American society then and now. You have another possible counterweight rolling over toward the administration, and that is, our most famous plutocrats, our most famous billionaires who are really kind of sucking up to the administration in a desperate attempt to get even more money. And again, what I think we're seeing here is not a problem of Trump, but a broader social failure of all of the institutions and participants in American society that are behaving, to my eyes, differently than they behaved in the past. And so again, this is what I was talking about earlier about what can IR theory tell us about this. I think IR theorists have to be able to do better at understanding the nature of societies. Now, that's not something we're usually comfortable doing. We like to look outward and look only at foreign policy. But part of that derives from, the country that is practicing that foreign policy. And so my pessimism derives from the fact that Trump will, of course, inevitably leave the scene. But the society that produced a Trump will endure.
A sobering thought. I think also what's going on here, Jonathan, is that there's a power grab in American democracy, and that the desire to acquire greater amounts of wealth reflects the way in which wealth has become a gateway to power. And I think that's sort of the insight there as to why people are looking to accumulate more and more amounts of money, because those folks now have a shot, whether it's at the presidency, whether it's controlling the presidency, in a way that just wasn't possible 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
Yes, let me give a shout out to a book by the Financial Times columnist Martin Wolf. It's called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And he really talks about how the concentrations of wealth and the way that wealth then captures power is a large part of our current problem.
Jonathan, this was wonderful. I always love talking to you. It was great to have you at our last dinner in New York. And I'm just a huge fan of your work, so I cannot recommend it enough. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure.
If you enjoyed listening to today's episode and want to join in on the conversation by becoming a member of the Hidden Forces Genius community, which includes Q&A calls with guests, access to special research and analysis, in-person events, and dinners, you can do that at hiddenforces.io/subscribe. And if you still have questions, feel free to send an email to info@hiddenforces.io, and I or someone from our team will get right back to you. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. You can follow me on Twitter @Kofinas, and you can email me at info@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.